Welcome to our deep dive today
Yeah.
into black and white landscape photography. It's perfect for you, whether you're just starting out or maybe you're looking to add like a new dimension to your photography. I have to admit, I'm no Ansel Adams, but luckily we have an expert with us today who is.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, even in like the age of, vibrant color photography, there's something so captivating about black and white landscapes. What is it about black and white landscapes?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a timelessness to black and white. It's almost like you're stepping outside of trends when you work with black and white. If you think about, some of the most iconic landscape photos, they're in black and white. They just have this feeling of permanence.
Right.
They're capturing something essential about a place.
Yeah. And you don't get distracted by the color.
Right.
It forces you to see the shapes, the textures.
Exactly. Black and white is all about emphasizing form, light, shadow. Suddenly, a gnarled tree trunk or the ripples in sand dunes, those become the stars of the show.
It's like turning up the visual volume on those elements. But what about mood? I feel like black and white landscapes can be so evocative.
For sure. It lets you tap into a wider range of emotions. If you have a high contrast scene with those deep blacks and bright whites, you can create drama power, but you can also go for a softer, low contrast look. And then that becomes more subtle, almost mysterious. Think about misty forests, snow scenes. It's really about the feeling that you as a photographer want to convey.
So where do we even begin? Gear-wise, are we talking fancy cameras, special lenses?
That's a great question. And the good news is you don't need to break the bank to get started with black and white landscape photography. Modern DSLRs, mirrorless cameras are great. The key is good dynamic range.
Okay.
But even film cameras can create stunning black and white landscapes. It's more about how you see than the gear itself.
Interesting. Okay, so seen in black and white,
Mm.
any tips for our listeners?
The biggest tip I can give you is to think about contrast. Contrast is your bread and butter. Light against dark, smooth textures against rough ones. Look for scenes where those contrasts are already strong. Pay attention to the lines as well. Roads, rivers, mountain ridges, use those to lead the viewer's eye through the image.
You're making me want to grab my camera and go for a hike right now. But what about light? Does that change in black and white?
Light is everything in photography, and especially with black and white. Especially those golden hours, early morning, late afternoon. That soft angled light creates amazing shadows and depth. Think about whether you want high contrast for a bold look or low contrast for something more serene.
This is blowing my mind. It's like a whole different way of looking at landscapes. And I bet editing plays a big role too.
Oh, it can, yeah. Shooting in raw format gives you the most flexibility later, and then you can play around with conversion tools, contrast adjustments, dodging and burning. You can really finesse the mood and highlight details.
So anyone can do this right, even if you're just starting out.
Absolutely. The best way to learn is to experiment. Go out, shoot a ton, see what works for you. Study the masters, yes, but don't be afraid to break the rules. Develop your own style, your own way of seeing.
I love that. So we've talked about seeing in black and white, understanding contrast, working with light, and even touched on gear. What else should we consider when composing a black and white landscape photo?
Composition is key. It's all about simplifying the scene and really emphasizing those essential elements.
Right.
Like you want to guide the viewer's eye through the image. You can use strong lines. You can use shapes, tonal contrasts.
Okay, so you're not just capturing a scene, you're crafting it. What are some of the things that go through your mind when you're composing a black and white landscape?
Well, one of the most powerful tools you have is leading lines. So think about a winding road leading into the distance, or a river cutting through a valley. These types of lines draw the viewer's eye into the scene, and they just create a sense of depth and movement.
It's like creating a path for the viewer to follow. And because you're working in black and white, those lines, they really stand out more, don't they?
They really do. Yeah.
Yeah.
The absence of color eliminates distractions, and it allows those lines and shapes to become the dominant elements in the composition. And speaking of eliminating distractions, negative space is another important concept to keep in mind.
Negative space, you mean like empty areas in the image? I always thought you wanted to fill the frame with as much stuff as possible.
Not necessarily. Sometimes less is more, especially in black and white. Negative space can create a sense of balance, simplicity, even grandeur. So think about a lone tree silhouetted against a vast expanse of sky. That emptiness around the tree actually makes it stand out more and adds to the overall impact of the image.
So it's not about cramming in as much detail as possible. It's about using that negative space to give it breathing room and emphasize those key elements.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, composition is all about creating visual relationships between the elements in your frame. So think about how the different shapes, the lines, and the tones they interact with each other. Are they harmonious? Are they creating tension? Are they creating drama?
So it's like composing music, only you're using visual elements instead of notes.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And just like music, there are certain compositional principles that can help you create harmonious and visually appealing images. The rule of thirds, for example, is a classic guideline that can help you create balanced and dynamic compositions.
Right, the rule of thirds, that's where you divide the frame into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and you place your key elements along those lines or at the intersections.
Exactly. It's simple, but it's a really effective way to avoid static-centered compositions. But don't be afraid to break the rules sometimes, too. Sometimes the most interesting compositions come from defying those traditional guidelines.
Yeah, it's all about experimenting and finding what works best for your vision.
Now, we've talked about how different types of light can affect the mood and feel of your black and white landscapes. Are there any specific techniques or approaches to shooting that work particularly well for black and white?
Absolutely. One technique that I love to use is long exposures.
Ah, yes. The dreamy, ethereal images where water looks like silken clouds seem to streak across the sky, those are always so captivating.
Yeah, long exposures are especially effective in black and white because they emphasize the contrast between the stationary objects and the moving elements. So the still objects remain sharp and defined, while those moving elements become blurred and they create a sense of motion and flow.
It's like capturing the passage of time in a single image. The long exposures require special equipment, right? Like a
Yeah.
tripod and neutral density filters. They do, yeah. A tripod is essential for keeping your camera perfectly still during the long exposure. And neutral density filters are like sunglasses for your lens. They reduce the amount of light entering the camera, which allows you to use longer shutter speeds, even in bright daylight.
So you're extending that exposure time to create that blur.
Exactly. And the length of the exposure will determine the degree of blur. A short exposure of a few seconds might create a subtle blurring of water, while a longer exposure of several minutes could turn clouds into wispy streaks across the sky.
Wow. It's amazing how you can really use time as a creative element in photography.
It really is, and that's just one example. There are so many other techniques that you can explore. Intentional camera movement, multiple exposures, panning, even shooting through different objects to create unique effects. The key is to experiment and see what speaks to you.
I love that. It's all about pushing the boundaries and seeing what's possible. But capturing a great image in camera is only half the story, right? What about post-processing? What role does that play in creating a compelling black and white landscape?
It's essential. Post-processing is a big part of the workflow. That's where you fine-tune the image and bring out its full potential. But it's important to remember that post-processing isn't about fixing a bad photo. It's about enhancing a good one.
So it's like the icing on the cake. You need a good cake to start with,
Mhm.
but the icing makes it delicious.
Exactly. And just like with cake, there are different flavors of icing.
Mhm.
In post-processing, you have a wide range of tools and techniques that you can use to really enhance those black and white landscapes.
What are some of the key things that you focus on when you're editing your black and white images?
The first thing is I always shoot in RAW format.
Why is RAW so important for black and white photography?
RAW files contain all the data that's captured by your camera sensor, so it gives you much more flexibility in post-processing. You have greater control over things like white balance exposure contrast, which are all super crucial for creating stunning black and white images.
So it's like having a digital negative that you can develop and manipulate in the digital darkroom.
Exactly. And once you have that raw file, you can start to explore different conversion techniques, adjust the contrast, fine-tune tones. You can even add or remove grain to create the desired look and feel.
Sound like there's a lot to learn, but also a lot of creative freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And the best way to learn is to experiment. Don't be afraid to try different techniques. Play with the sliders and see what works for you. There are no hard and fast rules in post-processing. It's all about finding what feels right for your vision.
So it's about developing your own style and aesthetic.
Exactly. And
Wow.
just like any art form, developing your style takes time. It takes practice. It takes a willingness to experiment. So don't be afraid to try new things. Break the rules. See where your creativity takes you.
I love that. This has been so insightful. It's amazing how much goes into creating a truly compelling black and white landscape. It's not just about pointing your camera and clicking the shutter. It's about seeing, feeling, and expressing your unique vision through the language of light, shadow, and tone. And speaking of vision, I think one of the most intriguing aspects of black and white photography is its ability to really evoke emotion.
Oh, absolutely. Black and white photography just has this incredible power to strip away the distractions of color and reveal the raw emotion of a scene. It's like you're looking into the soul of a place.
Yeah, it's like we connect with the landscape on a much deeper level, almost like we're seeing past the surface, into the heart of the place.
It is. I think that's a really good way to put it. When I'm out in nature with my camera, I'm often drawn to scenes that evoke a particular mood or feeling for me.
So it's not just about finding a pretty place. It's about finding a place that speaks to you emotionally.
Yeah, exactly. And then the challenge is, how do you translate that feeling into an image? How do you use light and contrast and composition and all the things we've been talking about to convey that emotion to the viewer?
It's like telling a story without words. You're using the visual elements.
Exactly. And that's really where black and white excels, because it eliminates that distraction of color and it forces us to focus on those essential elements, the shapes, the textures, the interplay of light and shadow.
And that allows the emotion to come through.
Exactly. Think about a photograph of a storm rolling in over a mountain range. In color, it might be a beautiful image, but in black and white, with those dark, brooding clouds, the stark contrast between the sky and the land, the jagged peaks, it just creates a palpable sense of drama and foreboding.
Yeah, you can almost feel the wind in the rain.
Exactly. Or imagine a photograph of a solitary tree standing in like a vast open field. In black and white, that image can evoke a sense of loneliness, resilience, even a touch of melancholy.
It's amazing how removing color can actually amplify the emotion.
That's the power of black and white photography. It allows us to tap into something deeper, something more primal. It's about capturing not just what we see, but what we feel when we're in that landscape.
It's like you're inviting the viewer to step into your shoes and experience that emotion firsthand.
And that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To create an image that goes beyond, just the purely visual and connects with the viewer on an emotional level.
I think you've just perfectly summed up why I am so drawn to black and white landscape photography. There's a depth, a richness, an emotional resonance that you just don't get with color.
Absolutely. And the best part is it's a journey of discovery. The more you explore, the more you learn about yourself, your vision, the way you see and feel the world around you.
I feel like my eyes have been opened today. You've given me a whole new way to look at black and white photography. It's not just about technique, it's about connecting with the landscape on a deeper level, and then expressing those emotions through my images.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping you'd take away from this. It's not about following rules or formulas. It's about finding your own voice, your own style, your own way of seeing and feeling the world.
It's about the creative freedom
Mhm.
and using it to tell stories.
I love that.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into black and white landscape photography. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Remember, it's not about the gear. It's not about technical perfection. It's about connecting with the landscape and expressing your unique vision. So get out there, experiment, explore, and most importantly, have fun.